Dear colleagues, thank you for the opportunity to say a few words today about mystic messages, the magic of writing. My name is Marc Küster. During the first incarnation of gʁafematik, I had the pleasure to speak to you about open and closed writing systems. Open writing systems such as the cuneiform writing system, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and the Chinese writing system have a core character repertoire, but one that can be easily extended. The character repertoire of closed writing systems, such as the Greek and Latin alphabets, but also the Hebrew abjad or the Hangul syllabary, are pretty much fixed. Contrary to appearance, my talk today is almost a footnote to my talk a couple of years ago. Ever since working on my geordnet Weltbild, I've subscribed to Gell's theory that for all its links to spoken language, writing is a fundamentally different science system. I've come to believe that this relationship differs between open and closed writing systems. In fact, the internal logic of open writing systems seems in many ways more interesting compared to that of closed ones. In comparison, the magic part of this talk is almost a coincidence. I wanted to showcase examples in which writing was imbued with meaning that its linguistic equivalent doesn't have. Already in my geordnet Weltbild, I had looked in detail at acrostics, in which the order of the alphabet becomes a metaphor for completeness and ultimately divine perfection. From here to number magic and Kabbalah, it is but a small step. What I'm not looking at are written representations of spoken magic, no grimoire, no spellbooks, or other collections of incantations that just reproduce spoken language. Though these are actually among very early examples of writing, and there might be an interesting study in and of themselves, especially as many grimoires invent their own script-like devices to record magic. The excursion to Japan is largely driven by my fascination with Japanese popular culture, but can, I trust, also be justified by the many ways in which it powerfully illustrates the magic of writing in examples of contemporary culture, and in a style that is quite different from that one applied to the West, but is actually increasingly influencing the one in the West. My concept of magic here is largely taken from Fraser's The Golden Bow, the classic that in many ways is overtaken by now, but whose core idea of magic as something akin to science in the mind of the practitioner is, for me, still a very valid take on things. Fraser imagined that the magician does not doubt that the same forces will always produce the same effects, that the performance of the proper ceremony, accompanied by the appropriate spell, will inevitably be attended by the desired result. And also that to neglect these rules, even in small details, is to incur failure. These illustrations actually pretty much from Fraser's time. One a reconstruction of Stone Age, the other one of the Druid in action. For millennia, and to a degree even to this day, magic is perceived as an oral and physical or ritual activity. At maximum, the formula might be written down, but the practice remained wedded to the spoken word. This has stayed like that for a very long time, and the first incarnations of what I would call really written magic that have come down to us are actually comparatively young. In cuneiform, the cuneiform writing system, they date from approximately 1000 BC. Of course, it doesn't mean that there have not been older examples that are still to be discovered. And it especially does not mean that there have not been examples of incantations written down, which are much older than this. But one of the oldest known examples, the so-called Babylonian Theodicy, dates back to, in fact, about 1000 BC. It's a masterpiece of its kind, in which a man laments his fate and discusses with a friend on the injustice of the world. Very much on the example of the biblical book of Job, which inscribes itself in the same type of literature, wisdom literature. The Babylonian Theodicy was written in 27 stanzas of 11 lines each, which each of the lines in a stanza starting with the same sign. This sign doesn't necessarily have to represent the same sound, though. The Babylonian Theodicy, but also the other acrostics, make use of the polyphony of sign values. So it's not alliteration that we are speaking about, it's really acrostic, a visual phenomenon. The message that the author inscribed, I, Sajil Kinabubib, the incantation priest, am adherent of the god and the king, was surely a message to the king, his master, which through this complex form was imbued with special potency that only the written form could transmit. There are not very many acrostics that have come down to us of this type from the Akkadian time. About 7 are known to us. Where cuneiform acrostics are relatively rare, acrostics in Hebrew literature and afterwards in alphabetic literature were much more common. The perhaps most famous example is Psalm 119, but there are many more examples in the Bible and beyond. What is produced here is the beginning of Psalm 9, which together with Psalm 10 forms a unity of an acrostic. These acrostics mirror the alphabet, so you see that it starts with Aleph, Bet, Gimel, and so on, in the sequence of the Hebrew alphabet. And this adherence to the order of the alphabet at the same time also reflection of the divine order that the author wanted to transmit. A different type of magic writing is this attempt by Sargon II, who reigned between 722 and 705 BC, to imbue the walls of his new capital, Dur Sharukin, with magical power. He linked the length of the city wall to the numerical value that he calculated from his name. And the formulation, this was already seen in the very early editions in the 19th century, links in detail the measurements, 4 sa, 3 near, 1 sos, etc., to the overall number of qubits, which is in some calculations 6,280 and sometimes slightly different. Nobody has yet quite deciphered the number scheme that is behind it and that maps the cuneiform characters to numbers, though there are multiple such theories out there, and there are even mappings between numerical values and cuneiform characters that have come down to us. Sargon wasn't particularly successful with his attempt at magic. He died a year after the building of the city walls in battle, and his young capital was abandoned and replaced by Nineveh shortly after. From Sargon's number magic to the Kabbalah, it's surely a big step in terms of time. The classical Kabbalah starts, in most views, in the late Middle Ages, in the 12th or 13th century. But it goes back much further, and the link to the idea of finding secret hidden meanings in text is quite fundamental to its way of operating. It's a double attempt to imbue text with magic, on the one hand by consciously encoding into them further layers of meaning, but for the Kabbalah, more importantly still, the imagination to derive such meanings from an analysis of hidden characteristics. Kabbalah lived, like, for that matter, much of the contemporary Christian biblical interpretation by assuming different levels of interpretation going from the literal over the allegoric, the associative to the hidden one, that is quite a characteristic. And I try to use, among others, Gematria and number magic to elicit these hidden meanings and find the true names of God and the link to the divine. Something that afterwards in this form was also taken over by Christian practitioners such as Ramon Lull, but that's not so much the topic here. This little anecdote from the Menachot actually goes quite far to showcase some of this imagination. It gives the vision of the sky and how God created the Torah, and how God actually shaped the individual forms of the letters, the crowns of the letters, and then imbued them with meaning. The practitioner is supposed to derive from each and every thorn of these crowns mounts and mounts of information of inspiration on Jewish law, on the Kabbalah, and take it from there. So meaning that is linked down to the very forms of the letters, something that naturally has no equivalent in spoken language. Another common technique was the Gematria, which most frequently used a classical mapping between the order of the Hebrew alphabet and numerical values, starting from Aleph with 1, Bet with 2, up to Tav for 400, something that incidentally the Hebrew script most likely took over from the Greek alphabet, so that there was experimenting with this in the context of Platonic philosophy quite a bit as well. A particularly important number was the number of 26, which is linked to the 4 letters of God's name. Yod, He, Vav, and again He, which makes by this numbering scheme 26. And these and other auspicious numbers also are negative numbers, were thought to be found in other places in the Bible, even in completely different types of texts linguistically. So it's a purely written form of link. Now this is a big cut now. We go from the late Middle Ages to contemporary Japan and its conception of magic. Japan has and always had a lively tradition of calligraphy and visual writing. And it had for a long time also a popular concept of magic and written magic in addition that is very much alive to this day. It starts out here with letters because they are really conceived as letters to the gods. Ema, which is a combination of image and Uma the horse, because actually at the very source they were horse dedications to the gods, and then paintings of horses that substituted the real ones. Since then they have broken the link to horses, but they are still very much used on an everyday basis. Here's an example from the Gata Shrine in Akihabara, so the technological center in Tokyo, which uses as illustrations anime characters. This actually is also a place in one of, or even a number of popular animes such as Love Live. It goes further than that. Some real-life shrines, such as the Shirakawa Hashiman Shrine, have been transformed into shrines, almost transformed shrines of anime characters, when the anime happens to be situated there. In this case, it's the game and anime Yugashi that plays in something that looks like the same shrine, but in a completely different settings. Spirited Away, Hayao Miyazaki's masterpiece, shows another example of written magic. The original title of this film, Sen and Chihiro Spiriting Away, actually shows it even clearer. You see it written here, but we will see it in the film itself, in the small fragment. The whole scene here, and indeed much of the film, which incidentally is to this day Japan's highest grossing box office hit, plays on the polyphony of the Zen sign that you see here, which has a Japanese reading, a kun reading of Chi, so it's the first syllable of Chihiro's name, but also a Chinese reading of Sen, an on reading of Sen, which incidentally also stands for the word 1000. The witch, Yubaba, is restricted in her magic that she can transform text, she can use the letters of the text, but she cannot fundamentally change it. But still, by removing, on the one hand, the Japanese reading of Chihiro's name and switching to the Chinese one, Yubaba removes Chihiro from her roots, but also by using Sen, the term for 1000, she replaces her true personality by money, or at least she tries to. And indeed, a good part of the film is the story of Sen, Chihiro, finding her true identity, her true name again. Another example that actually plays with the letters themselves is Baka Monogatari, an extremely popular and long-living series of anime, of which this one is, at least in terms of release, the first. The hero, Koyomi Aragi, meets a young girl, Majoya Hashikushi, which, as you will see, actually gives away part of the story. This girl is lost, and they try to find out why, with the help of Aragi's spiritual master, whom they consult on the phone.
案内ですか。
あ、お前、迷子なんじゃないのか?
You are lost?
いえ、迷子です。カタツムリの迷子です。
Yes, I'm lost. I'm a lost snail. A snail?
いえ、私。
迷い牛だろう、そりゃ。カタツムリを漢字で書きゃ牛って入っているでしょうが。渦巻きの渦の三髄を虫へに変えて、それで牛。カタツムリだよ。人を迷わせ
The point is that while there is no folklore of lost snails, there is plenty of folklore surrounding lost cows, which lead human wanderers to perdition. And through the very writing that is exemplified here in the anime explicitly, as you've seen, the link is made between snail and cow, so that actually this girl turns out to be somebody, a spirit, leading or trying to lead wanderers astray. Then the rest of the story is how to actually resolve this problem. A last example, taken from the Naga Mia manga, shows a scene where the Shinto god Nogami, who's not terribly well known and who doesn't have many adherents, recruits a new magical helper. They call a Shinki, a sort of assistant. And he does so by literally inscribing the name on their skin. So he inscribes this character, which you see here, on the skin of his new assistant, and reads it in 3 different ways. One, the name he uses to actually address him on an everyday basis, Yuki. The other one that calls him into action in his role. But the most important one is his secret name, his divine name. Now there is, which should not normally be spoken. Now there is yet another link in that Yuki actually means snow, which you see illustrated here in the background through the snowflakes. And with that, it's time to wrap up. We have seen in this little talk examples of techniques used to encode written magic, going from acrostics in cuneiform and in alphabetic writing systems, over number magic, to the use of character shapes, radicals, or parts of characters, to the use of polyphony of characters. We have seen that there are layers of meaning encoded only in writing. The concrete mechanisms used in open-closed writing systems may work differently, but for both of them, writing is a way to transmit messages that are deeper than and go beyond spoken language. And with this, I would like to thank you for your time, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Marc. And thank you especially for bringing Miyazaki into this conference. This was very nice. I'm waiting for questions by the audience. In the meantime, can you tell me about the relation in Japan between a person's identity and the character of the name? I remember in 1Q84 by Murakami, where the name of the main character is very important and comes up all over the story again as a set of features of the character. How is this relation between the identity of the person and the kanji character?
Indeed, even in completely normal life, so outside the scene of anime and culture in general, there is just a certain link between the kanji and the name as it's spoken. So the written and the spoken name coexist without it being necessarily obvious to conclude from one to the other. So both have their very own identity in many cases, not in all cases. And this is something very different from the way it's handled mostly in Western, or indeed in general in closed writing systems, where the reading of the name is typically more or less phonetic, not always 100%, but typically. And often you have, if necessary, on a visiting card and a business card, the intended pronunciation added to it in syllabic characters, in addition to the kanji that is meant for this. So in this sense, while I'm very far from a specialist in Japanese culture, from all I see, it is a phenomenon that actually exists in culture in general, and this relation between written and pronounced versions of the name. To a lesser degree, we have that, of course, as well. Names are, especially last names, are very conservative in their spelling in European languages as well.
Well, in Arabic classical culture, the name is a kind of biography. It starts with the father's name, and then name of children, of place of birth, and sometimes profession, and it can be very long. It can have 15 words, and it's somehow the complete biography of the person.
Incidentally, something that when what we now have as family names came about, we had to a lesser degree as well in Europe, when the name captured characteristics or the profession of our ancestors at the time. Sure, not to the same extent as in Arabic culture.
So I don't see any questions. Well, thank you very much then. It was extremely insightful, and I hope we will get much more information in your paper.
Thank you for this opportunity and for the whole event, Yanis.
Thank you.